everybody, welcome back to Film Gold. This is episode 34 and this is part 3 of our deep dive into the film Citizen Kane. Obviously, if you haven't heard the first 2 parts, it would be a good idea to do that. These parts were looking at how Orson Welles came to make the film, and then the writing, and then elements of the production, such as the editing, sound, music, etc. I haven't talked about the aftermath of the film. I'll do that after we've actually gone through the film itself. So we're going to be going scene by scene. This is not an audio commentary. I did consider that, playing the film and then talking over it, but I feel that's sort of restricting, because if I want to go off on a tangent of some kind or offer some interesting bit of information and then something comes on the screen that I want to comment on, I can't finish the thing I was going to talk about. So I prefer just to do it in this way. I suppose you could watch along with the film in a sense, because I'm going to be describing each scene, not in exhaustive detail. As I mentioned in the other parts, I would recommend some prior knowledge of this film to get the most out of what I'm doing here. But I will talk about, this is the next scene. So you could follow along in some sense, but not strictly. Just before we get to the first scene, I wanted to talk about the first time I really recognised this film's quality. I had seen it a few times, 3 or 4 times, and I was living on an island in Thailand, and I think it was around 2009, I want to say. And I'd been working quite hard, and I'd got myself a day off. And on this island, they had a lot of flea markets, and you could get a lot of DVDs. And DVDs were not exactly new then, but they were still like a little bit of a novelty. And I bought up a load of DVDs, and one of them was Citizen Kane. And I'd always been meaning to watch it again. But one of the things I've always loved about DVDs is the special features, commentaries and so forth. Because with the really good films, having a commentary by the director, the writer, even just a film historian or someone who's a fan of the film who knows some of the technical details, it really helps in some cases. So anyway, it was just weird to be on an island in Southeast Asia looking at this film that was made in America in nearly 70 years earlier, as it was then. Now it's obviously a lot more. I started watching it and I put the commentary on, and it was a film historian who had a lovely soft northeast, aka Geordie, accent. And right from the off, you could just tell that he was very passionate about this film, but delivered in a very calm way. I suppose that's kind of what my delivery is supposed to be like. Not that I calculate it like that, but I am very passionate about things, but my delivery comes over a certain way, I think, on all my podcasts. Anyway, having watched the film with this audio commentary in just this perfectly weird setting of a morning, as I said, on an island in Southeast Asia with the sun blazing down, I just completely understood the greatness of this film. I don't know if I've said this in the previous parts, but with some films, you almost have to see them with someone pointing stuff out to really fully grasp them. And I know films are supposed to be about primarily entertainment. There are certain films that would be great for film school, but maybe not particularly that entertaining. And just going to refer one more time to this tag of being the greatest film ever. I remember actually watching this with a family member, and I said, this is Citizen Kane. This is supposed to be the greatest film ever. And after 20 minutes, they said, I don't think this is the greatest film ever. And what it was that nothing particularly explosive had happened. I think we did talk about this with Ghosty on the Orson Welles special we did last year. Something epic like maybe Apocalypse Now or 2001 Space Odyssey, that might have more claim purely because it's so epic. It either spans a massive amount of time or it's looking at something incredibly intense and surreal like a war, particularly a war in a place where the American soldiers didn't really know, which again was Southeast Asia. Obviously this time it was Vietnam. I did recommend a couple of documentaries in the first couple of parts of this series. But without further ado, I'm going to just play you a little bit of this ominous music. I'm not going to put the clips in as I'm recording this, but when I'm editing it, I may well put them in. So you may have some sound clips and maybe some clips from the film as well to look forward to break up my commentary. So here's a little bit of this music, and the first word of the film is also Charles Foster Kane's final word. Right, last chance to watch the film, or rewatch it before I spoil it for you. As I did in the other parts, I'll be reading some stuff from Wikipedia to give the official version, if you like, of what's happening in each scene, and then I'll just point stuff out that were of interest to me when I was rewatching it and researching it. So we get the titles. They're very simple. There were no credits in the opening titles. You get them at the end of the film. But apparently this was quite unusual for the time as well, just as we saw with the trailer before. So the first scene is outside of Xanadu. You've got a chain link fence. You've got a no trespassing sign. And this opening music by Bernard Herrmann, it's low brass and woodwind. And there's a Gothic horror isolation feel to this whole thing. You've got monkeys hanging out on the gate of what looks like a dilapidated mansion. And if you notice when you watch the film, there's a light on in a window in the distance, and it remains constant there. That light and the window are still there through various dissolves that bring us closer to this mansion. Then the light goes out, and then suddenly we're inside, and we get the snow from what we see as a snow globe. The elderly Charles Foster Kane is on his deathbed, holding a snow globe. He utters his last word that you just heard before, Rosebud, and dies. Now, Rosebud becomes what Hitchcock called the MacGuffin. It's almost like a red herring. It's a plot device that sets the story in motion and the characters pursue it, but it has no identity or importance of its own. Not entirely true in this case, because it obviously has importance to the main character, what turns out to be Rosebud. I could spoil it now, but I feel like I'll just spoil it at the end anyway, just in case. Here it's the culmination of this story, but it's not the resolution of the story. That's what makes it MacGuffin. You get this incredible close-up. I mean, you just take this for granted now. It's obviously Charles Foster Kane's mouth. He says these words. The moustache there was made of several separate tufts of hair. It wasn't just a fake moustache. The nurse comes in, and note the framing. There's an archway over the door. I used to think that the nurse was reflected in the snow globe, but that can't be true, obviously, because the snow globe falls to the floor and shatters. Then, out of that, we get a complete change of pace and a change of everything, and we get a news segment called News on the March. News on the March! That was what the guy sounded like.
News on the March!
Just an incredible change of pace. It's a very, very good parody of these newsreels from the time. It was supposed to be a parody of the March of Time. I mean, that's clear from the name. But other newsreel shows, and I believe Orson Welles and Stanley Kubrick as well. As I mentioned in an earlier part, I was recently reading a Stanley Kubrick biography. And you get this marvellously over-the-top voice, which is actually voiced by William Allard. I mentioned him when I was going through the cast. He was one of the voices on War of the Worlds, obviously Orson's famous radio broadcast, but he's also Thompson the reporter, and I'll tell you who that is if you can't remember. He comes into the story very soon. Now, this scene, I need to point out something about the absolute craziness of the way this story is told, and I mean that in a good way. It's almost a compliment because it still works. Just think about this. So we've had an opening scene, we've seen somebody die, and then we're going to get the story of their life up to that point where they die. That's a fairly classic way to tell a story. But what we get here with News on the March, just reading from Wikipedia, a newsreel obituary tells the life story of Kane, Charles Foster Kane, an enormously wealthy newspaper publisher and industry magnate. Kane's death becomes sensational news around the world. So that's obviously telling us what's happening in that scene without us knowing anything else about it, only that we've seen an old man die and say the word Rosebud. But let's think about this. As I said, we've had the death of an elderly character. Now what we're getting is a newsreel summary of his life, which is basically telling us what we're about to see in the 1 hour, 45 minutes left of the film. In a way, this is almost like, this is suicidal filmmaking. It's akin to what Alfred Hitchcock did in Psycho, which was to kill off his leading lady after an hour. And if you remember Psycho, we've followed Janet Leigh, we've become invested in her story. And then, spoiler alert again, she's suddenly killed in one of the most famous scenes in movie history. And people have said about Hitchcock, I mean, that's absolutely mad to do that. This is kind of similar. I mean, you're just laying out what we're about to see. Now, of course, it's not exactly what we see, because there's actually some details in this newsreel that you don't see in the events that unfold, which is quite strange. And there's one in particular, a massive event in Kane's life that doesn't happen to him directly, but is huge for him. And I'll mention it when we get to the chronology, because I've kind of worked out a chronology of Charles Foster Kane, helped by the fact there is actually a Wikipedia article for the character himself, as well as Orson Welles and the film. I mean, there's so much detail just in this one section, and I can't imagine how much work it would be to put all this together. I'll just point out a few things. We get some stats of Xanadu, which is the palace/castle, which is obviously based on William Randolph Hearst's San Simeon estate. We talked about all of that in the previous sections. 100,000 trees, 20,000 tons of marble, just to make Xanadu's mountain. The possessions are described, this is a nice turn of phrase, the loot of the world, including animals, 2 of each, the biggest zoo since Noah, an empire upon an empire. He's described as America's Kubla Khan. There's newspaper headlines, as they said, from his death, but around the world in many different languages. I promise I won't keep going a go at the makeup, but that's the only thing that spoils it slightly for me. I said earlier, I wonder if some computer effects could be used. You know, may as well use technology if it's there to sort the makeup out. I don't know. So we see kind of video snippets, if you like, from various points in Kane's life. We mentioned before about him being accused of being both a communist and a fascist. And there's a little interview segment from this News on the March where he says, "I am, have been, and will only be one thing, an American." I did mention the American dream before. I don't know what Kane thinks about that, but the difference really is that Kane is gifted his wealth, and we'll get to that in the next scene. The American dream is about working your way up from nothing. So it's not quite the same thing. But remember that the original name for the script was American before it became Citizen Kane. Now we see Kane with Hitler and his cronies. I think it's on a balcony. I'm not watching the film along with this, but I can remember it fairly well. And that, of course, calls to mind the film Zelig, the Woody Allen film in 1983. And I know Woody Allen loved this film. One of the commentaries they mentioned that cheesecloth was rubbed on the film to get this old-timey, not quite perfect look of the footage. And that calls to mind, I mentioned before about New Hollywood and about how Scorsese and De Palma, etc. loved Orson Welles and loved this film. That calls to mind the home movies in Raging Bull. They did a similar thing. They scratched the negative or whatever they do. I'm not very technical with these kind of things. They scratched it to make it almost like flicker, you know, if that's the right word. They mentioned the breakup of his first marriage and then his second marriage. And there's more details about that later. We see an elderly Kane in this newsreel. And bear in mind that Orson Welles was 25 when he was shooting this, being interviewed. And if you watch the film back, the guy who's interviewing him is Greg Toland, who's the wizard of the camera that we've already heard quite a lot about. Kane says,
I'm always glad to be back, young man. I'm an American. Always been an American. Anything else? When I was a reporter, we asked him quicker than that. Come on, young fella.
Well, what do you think of the chances for war in Europe?
I've talked with the responsible leaders, the great powers, England, France, Germany, and Italy. They're too intelligent to embark on a project which would mean the end of civilization as we now know it. You can take my word for it. There'll be no war.
Referring to World War II. So this is very much towards the end of his life. That's not the only time that war and other world events play a part in this story. We'll get to that. Now, after this newsreel, this is a very, very clever thing. So we've been watching a newsreel as if we're a viewer in the cinema, maybe watching, because newsreels used to be shown in the cinema. They were in England anyway, presumably in America as well. But then suddenly we cut to the projection room. I talked before about the chiaroscuro technique, which is light and dark. So here you get bright lights and dark shadows. And what happens here? The newsreel's producer tasks reporter Jerry Thompson. Now, Thompson, as I said, the actor, did that News on the March sequence. We're discovering the meaning of Rosebud. And this is the first example of the fast talking and the fast moving of the film. That is quite similar to a typical film of the 30s and early 40s in Hollywood. Now, is this an example of it, or is it somehow parodying it? I don't know. But it contrasts very well with the slower, more ominous parts of the film. And everything is just so superbly reflected by sound and music. The moods are reflected by the music. There's quite a lot of voices in this projection room, and some of you may know that Joseph Cotten is one of the voices, but I didn't realise until I saw this again, you can clearly see him there as well, sitting down there, and I'd have to call that a slight error. I don't know if people noticed at the time. Probably the film has been brightened up quite a bit. Perhaps it was very dark, the original prints, and you might not see that it's Joseph Cotten, but that seems an error because obviously he plays Leland, and there's no reason why Leland, particularly a young Leland, would be there. Anyway, the boss has a great speech here saying that he needs an angle, and then there's a subtle reference here. He says, all we saw on that screen was an American, but how is he different from Ford or Hearst? So I didn't realise that William Randolph Hearst was mentioned in the script. It goes by very fast. Again, I don't know how many people would have noticed that or particularly picked up on it.
How about it, Mr. Orson?
How do you like it, boys?
Well, 70 years in a man's life.
That's a lot to try to get into a newsreel.
It's a good shot, Thompson, but what it needs is an angle.
Yeah.
All we saw on that screen was that Charles Foster Kane is dead. I know that. I read the papers. You see, Thompson, it isn't enough to tell us what a man did. You've got to tell us who he was.
Needs that angle.
Wait a minute. What were Kane's last words? Do you remember, boys?
Yes, where?
What were the last words he said on Earth? Maybe he told us all about himself on his deathbed.
Yeah, and maybe he didn't. Maybe it was
All we saw on that screen was a big American.
one of the biggest.
But how is he any different from Ford, or Hearst for that matter, or John Doe?
Yeah, sure.
I tell you, Thompson, a man's dying words.
What were they? You don't read the papers.
When Charles Foster Kane died, he said just one word.
Rosebud.
That all he said?
Rosebud.
Tough guy, huh?
Yes, Rosebud.
Eyes calling
Just
for
that
Rosebud.
one word. But who is she?
What was that?
Here's a man that could have been president, who was as loved and hated and as talked about as any man in our time. But when he comes to die, he's got something on his mind called Rosebud. Now, what does that mean?
A racehorse he bet on once.
Yeah, that didn't come in.
All right. But what was the race?
Rosebud.
Get in touch with everybody that ever knew him. Oh, who knew him well. His second wife. She's still living.
Susan Alexander
He's
Kane.
running a nightclub in Atlantic City.
Yeah, that's right.
See them all. Get in touch with everybody that ever worked for him. Whoever loved him. Whoever hated his guts. I don't mean go through the city directory, of course.
I'll get on it right away, Mr. Orson.
Good.
Then we get a famous line.
Rosebud. Dead or alive. It'll probably turn out to be a very simple thing.
So from now, we get the idea that the film is basically a kind of intrepid reporter, almost like a mystery story, trying to discover what Rosebud is. And as I said just before, it kind of is. There is a culmination, but really it's a film about a man. It's not about just his last words. So once again, it's what the film is doing, what Wells was clearly doing with this film, is trying to throw the viewer off a lot, to keep them guessing. And in that clip that I replayed in part one, which was from the Orson Welles special we did, somebody said, there's an idea in every scene. Wells is constantly throwing you off. And what I was saying earlier was that you can't really get the full scope of that, in a sense, without knowing that it's there. It shouldn't be like that. Films should be able to stand on their own merits. And this does, but I just feel like when you know all the ideas that are involved in this, it just makes it seem like a big achievement. Some people have actually said that this is a great achievement rather than a great film. Okay, so from here, this reporter Thompson sets out to interview Kane's friends and associates. And that's all well and good, but the timeline is not linear, as we know. So there's a lot of jumping around. And what I'm going to try and do is tell you in each scene where we are in Kane's story, like roughly how old he is, etc. So in the present, Thompson goes to see a drunken, faded Susan Alexander, Kane's second wife, at El Rancho, the club that she now owns. Now, I don't remember if it's this El Rancho scene or the next one, because there's two, or maybe even both, but we get a famous shot. The camera moves from outside the skylight to the inside of the nightclub through a single flash of lightning. And that's something that is used a few times. There'll be a flash or some event will happen which will enable us to dissolve from one place to another, like outside a building to inside, for example. Susan quite angrily refuses to talk to Thompson. When I was looking at the Susan Kane scenes, the two of them in El Rancho, I was thinking of her as almost a bit of a Julie Garland figure, particularly having watched the film Judy with Renee Zellweger as Judy Garland. A really, really good interpretation, I thought that was. People are treading on eggshells. As I said, she owns this club, so she's the boss, but she's a drunk, and she's probably, it seems, quite a character, quite a volatile character at this point in her life, with all the things that she's been through. So she comes across as quite fragile, as I said, a bit like Judy Garland. We then get a shot, which is another one that you will see in more than one new Hollywood film. I'm thinking, for example, of Taxi Driver. So in this scene, you get Susan drinking on the left screen, the nightclub employee is in the middle, and then Thompson is on the right talking to his boss saying, what should I do now? She doesn't want to talk to me. And in Taxi Driver, I'm sure from memory, there's a part where Travis is calling Betsy, the Sybil Shepherd character, and I think you see a corridor on the right, and the camera moves. I don't think the camera moves in this case, but you just get that left, middle, and right. Or sometimes it's left and right. So you've got two or more things going on at the same time, and it's holding your attention and diverting your attention in different directions as well. If you think of Orson Welles as a trickster, and of course he was an amateur magician as well, he's constantly playing with us as the viewer. And now we get another remarkable visual here. Thompson goes to the Thatcher Library, not only a visual, in fact, the sound as well. He goes to the private archive of the late banker Walter Parks Thatcher, who we will meet very soon. And just this marvellously atmospheric lighting and this echoey sound. And it's actually foreshadowing when we see Xanadu, when Kane is elderly. There's a similar echo and a similar sense of this cavernous building, completely lacking in any atmosphere. And Wells had apparently used similar lighting in the famous Julius Caesar production in 1937. I did mention that before. Modern dress, bare stage production that evoked comparison to contemporary fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. So in a funny way, perhaps the architects of the Nuremberg rally should get the credit for this. Only kidding. Apparently, even in an early 16mm Wells film called Hearts of Age in 1934, it used similar lighting. And then he would go on to do something slightly similar in The Trial in 1962. Certainly that echoey sound. If you remember in that film, the scene where he's walking through the office and you get all the sound of the typewriters. It really does evoke this soulless, very, very strange atmosphere that you get in this library and you get in Xanadu later on. There's basically a security guard in this library as well, and there's a spinstery woman very sternly telling Thompson, he's got limited time and he can only see certain files.
The directors of the Thatcher Memorial Library have asked me to remind you again, Mr. Thompson, of the conditions under which you may inspect certain portions of Mr. Thatcher's unpublished memoirs. Yes, Jennings. I bring him right in.
All I want
Under
to know
no
is...
circumstances are direct quotations from his manuscript to be used by you.
Well, that's all right. I'm just looking for one.
Jennings. Thank you, Jennings. Mr. Thompson, you will be required to leave this room at 4:30 promptly. You will confine yourself, it is our understanding, to the chapters in Mr. Thatcher's manuscript regarding Mr. Kane.
That's all I'm interested in. Thank you.
Pages 83 to 142.
Through Thatcher's written memoirs, Thompson learns about Kane's rise from a Colorado boarding house and the decline of his fortune. So we get flashback here. Now another big change of pace and a change of music. And essentially in this scene, this is where Charles Foster Kane, as a boy of around 8 years old, is given away. The childhood scenes are also, this was pointed out in one of the audio commentaries, also using woodwind, which was used in that original music right at the beginning of the film. But so completely different, and it's reflecting a carefree childhood as young Kane plays with his sled. Hint, hint. The range of music and the sound in this film in general is amazing, and it's hard to really appreciate while you're trying to keep up with the story. That's the thing. I mentioned earlier, someone had said, watch this film once for the story and watch it again and just try to look out for the lighting and all the interesting camera angles and listen out for the music and the way it's used. As I said, there is a Charles Foster Kane Wikipedia page, so I'm going to try and piece together, because I was very curious about this. What is the Kane timeline? Now, it does fall apart slightly at various points, but let's not nitpick too much. So it seems like the Charles Foster Kane character was born in, I'm going to say 1863. It says 62 or 63. Let's just say 63 to 1941. So he's supposed to have just died at the time the film is coming out. So we get some history here. In 1871, gold was discovered through a mining deed belonging to Kane's mother, Mary. Mother Mary, eh? One for the Beatles fans. Played by Agnes Moorehead, who I mentioned when I was talking about the cast. She hired Thatcher to establish a trust that would provide for Kane's education and assume guardianship of him in return for an annual income of $50,000. Now try and imagine Kane's mother and his father getting $50,000 a year in 1871. I mean, that is a serious chunk of change. $50,000 a year is a good salary now. You know, you can judge people, but that is a massive sum to turn down. The father is against it, but he seems quite subordinate to his wife. Now, of course, you're giving away your child, but what I've learned through studying human behaviour, if people can justify things to themselves, they can basically do anything. It's all about self-justification. While the parents and Thatcher discuss arrangements inside the boarding house, the young Kane plays happily with a sled, as we said, and he's also throwing snowballs. Now, interesting framing. This is the kind of thing that if you did it now, people would say, oh yeah, you're just copying Citizen Kane, you're just coming up with a cliche bit of symbolism, but it wasn't done in those days, I don't think. Maybe it was done in old Russian films, German Expressionism. But Kane is framed in the middle, playing on his sled, and you've got his parents on one side and his new trustee, Thatcher, on the other side. So the framing, he's clearly in the middle, he's the piggy in the middle, and these two sets of adults are deciding his future. I didn't want to get topical with this, but it's funny that in the news at the moment, we've got Trump and Putin meeting to decide the fate of Ukraine and how long the war will go on. When I was thinking about that, when I was following the news last week, I was thinking that's quite similar, isn't it? Ukraine almost being used as a teenager or a child, and the adults are deciding their fate. Anyway, when Kane's parents introduce him to Thatcher and he's told he'll be living with him, the boy strikes Thatcher with his sled and attempts to run away. So we get a little bit of character insight here. The young Kane and the older Kane, they're independent and somewhat rebellious. And these are my words, not liking other people's terms. That will be part of a famous line from the script later on. Remember that one for later. I said before, it's not quite the American dream because he didn't have to earn that money. But it's also different from William Randolph Hearst because Hearst was born into wealth. Kane wasn't born into it, but he got it at 8 years old. We're going to say he's 8 years old here. Now, a couple of details about this scene. Agnes Moorehead is so good. I mean, she's doing very little, but she just has that look in her eye and a certain presence. You've got George Coulouris. Those guys are both Mercury players, by the way. He was actually from Manchester. He's doing a very good posh, I don't know, is that posh American or posh British or somewhere in the middle, of Greek extraction he was. So Charles is told he'd be going on a trip. Which again is a kind of deception that adults often do and they don't want to tell you what's actually happening. Oh, just going off on a holiday. You get the idea here, and I think the young boy playing Kane actually does a really good job. You can see he's pretty suspicious, he doesn't really buy it. So you get the idea that maybe Kane is someone who is quite perceptive, quite an intelligent person. He's got this very, very annoyed look on his face. And then we get this amazing close-up of the mother. And it looks to me like slow motion. I'm not sure if it actually is. Maybe it's just slowed down slightly. You get this turn of the head down to her son. And then you get a dissolve of the famous sled. Now, one more detail. Again, I didn't pick this up until this viewing. Because I think the last time I saw this film, I wasn't particularly a White Stripes fan. I knew who they were, but I've got into them in the last 10 years or so. Now, if you watch the film back, Charles outside when he's playing on his sled and throwing snowballs, shouts, "The Union forever." I feel like I'm making you work now, aren't I, listeners? But try and keep that in your mind, the Union forever. I'll explain it a bit later. Then we go forward to Kane at apparently 25 years of age, as Orson Welles was. When I was talking about the makeup in part 2, I was saying that Welles said he was also made up to look young, or to improve him as a young man, looks-wise. Kane, in this scene, receives the New York Inquirer. And it's an interesting thing here. We get a verbal jump cut. I think I mentioned this briefly before. Thatcher giving the boy Kane a present with a Merry Christmas, and then he says, "And a Happy New Year," 15 years later. Thatcher has written to Kane, and then he's then reading Kane's reply, and the line that he is quite disgusted by, "I think it would be fun to run a newspaper." He reads a newspaper headline in disgust, and then we get a wonderful entrance of the grown-up 25-year-old Kane, Orson Welles obviously, appearing from behind the newspaper, and he's sitting in a chair very nonchalantly and casually drinking a cup of tea, looking very youthful, and he's got that Orson Welles cheeky glint in his eye. And if you think of The Third Man, 8 years later, when he appears out of the doorway, one of those just magnificent entrants, I love it. He's got that cheeky look as well. I think I used the word impish when I talked about it with Ghosty. Yeah, he's got this cheeky glint in his eye and kind of a cheeky voice as well. This is some more detail just from Wikipedia. By the time Kane gained control of his trust at the age of 25, the mine's productivity and Thatcher's prudent investing had made Kane one of the richest men in the world. Kane took control of the New York Inquirer newspaper and embarked on a career of yellow journalism, a term apparently invented by William Randolph Hearst, or perhaps it was invented to describe William Randolph Hearst, publishing scandalous articles that attacked Thatcher's and his own business interests. So yeah, yellow journalism, I would just really call it tabloid journalism. The literal meaning of a tabloid newspaper is that it's a smaller newspaper than a broadsheet, which is the larger one. Not necessarily making up news, although that could happen, but exaggerating, sensationalising things. Now we get the entrance of Leland and Bernstein. So we got Jedediah Leland, played by Joseph Cotton. I can't remember Bernstein's first name, but he's mostly just referred to as Mr. Bernstein or Bernstein. So that's Joseph Cotton, as I said, and Everett Sloane. And there's more fast talk and fast-paced movement. I said before that Orson Welles designed this film that there would be quite long scenes. And so Greg Toland had to absolutely be on his toes, as did the actors. Kane, Leland and Bernstein are a bit of a kind of triple act, if you like. Leland and Bernstein are the apparent friends of Kane, but they're pretty much doing his bidding. Leland, probably describe him later as almost like the moral compass, because he's quite an everyman. He's reacting in the way that we would probably react, the average person. Now, this thing of having Kane as the centre of attention and then people around him are slightly friends but also kind of cronies at the same time. A comparison has been made to this and the Mercury Theatre, and when we did the Welles special, I said to Ghosty, was Welles a people person? And he said yes, but as long as he was in charge. And I totally get that, and I feel that as well with Paul McCartney. If you don't know, I do a podcast about John Lennon. I'm not having to go at Paul McCartney for that reason, but he's a bit like that, because I've heard inside stuff, particularly from Mark Lewison, who worked for him. He's the number one Beatles expert, if you don't know. He said, yeah, everything's fine until you rebel, and then he turns a bit nasty. Leland, the Joseph Cotton character, might be slightly based on John Houseman, who was Wells's partner. I'm going to assume that most of you listened to the first two parts. I'm not going to go back and explain all that again. Houseman was there, of course, when Herman Mankiewicz was writing the original script. Right, the next scene, Kane is running the paper, and we get this famous line to do with the Spanish-American War of 1898.
You provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war.
And that is a slight paraphrase of a line said by William Randolph Hearst, allegedly, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. Now, in terms of the timeline, this isn't quite right, because that would make Kane at this time 35, and I think he's supposed to be 25. Again, I'm not going to split hairs. Kane makes a pledge to support the working man and give them honest reporting. The contradiction here is pretty obvious with all this yellow journalism and providing the war. And it becomes a big part of Kane's persona as he gets older. It's a key part that he thinks he's one thing, but in reality he's something different. I think it's just after this that Thatcher tells Kane that the Inquirer is losing $1 million a year. And again, that's in the late 19th century. There's a lot of money. And Kane says,
You're right, Mr. Thatcher. I did lose $1 million last year. I expect to lose $1 million this year. I expect to lose $1 million next year. You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
said again with that impish smile on his face. It's very charming. I mean, Orson Welles here in his mid-20s is very, very charismatic. I would say he's conventionally good looking, but he's certainly attractive. Then we get a little bit of a speech written by Mankiewicz, but delivered superbly with Welles, and I'll play you the speech now.
Charles, I think I should remind you of a fact that you seem to have forgotten.
Yes.
That you are yourself one of the largest individual stockholders in the Public Transit Company.
The trouble is you don't realize you're talking to two people. As Charles Foster Kane, who owns 82,364 shares of public transit preferred, you see, I do have a general idea of my holdings. I sympathize with you. Charles Foster Kane is a scoundrel. His paper should be run out of town. A committee should be formed to boycott him. You may, if you can form such a committee, put me down for a contribution of $1,000.
My time's
On the other hand, I am the publisher of the Inquirer. As such, it's my duty, and I'll let you in on a little secret. It's also my pleasure to see to it that decent, hard-working people in this community aren't robbed blind by a pack of money-mad pirates just because they haven't anybody to look after their interests. I'll let you in on another little secret, Mr. Thatcher. I think I'm the man to do it, you see. I have money and property. If I don't look after the interests of the underprivileged, maybe somebody else will. Maybe somebody without any money or property.
Notice the change there in Kane from jokey and jovial to deadly serious. We get a bit more exposition as we learn that Kane was educated in lots of top colleges. I think they even mentioned the top 3 colleges in the US and some ones abroad as well. It turns out that Kane and Leland were educated together, but I don't think Leland was expelled from all those schools, but Kane was. So again, you get this idea, he's rebellious, he doesn't fit in. You could make comparisons with Orson Welles. I don't know if he necessarily didn't fit in as he was growing up, but certainly at a certain point he found that he was a square peg in a round hole when it came to Hollywood and people trying to impose rules on him. That's what it comes down to. That's where you get that similarity, the Kane and Welles similarity. Right, now we suddenly go forward about 30 years, I'm going to say. I think we're now in the early 30s. It's just after the 1929 stock market crash. And suddenly, Kane is in financial trouble and he signs over control of his newspaper empire to Thatcher's bank. Now, obviously, the reason they put it here is so that we can see Kane at the very beginning of his newspaper career and then at the very end. But it's very strange, and I'll explain why in a sec. Anyway, Kane is now around 70 years old, so I don't know how old Thatcher is supposed to be. I mean, he must be about 100, but I think the shock effect of seeing Kane so much older is quite effective. And also the fact that their relationship hasn't changed. Thatcher is still disapproving of Kane, even though before Kane was young and Thatcher was old, now Kane's old and Thatcher is ancient. I do like making references to my other podcast, and this reminds me quite a bit of the John Lennon Aunt Mimi relationship in a way. Not that John Lennon, of course, got to 70, unfortunately he didn't, but even when he was 40 and a world-famous rock star, he still had his aunt disapproving of him, and they probably argued about the same stuff that they argued about when he was a kid. And you get the feeling this, with Kane and Thatcher, is a similar thing. They're never going to see eye to eye. Fantastic line in the script. Kane says,
I always gagged on that silver spoon.
So he was given this wealth, but he was never comfortable with it. Perhaps he wanted to earn it himself. Another line, if I hadn't been very rich, I might have been a really great man. And then he says, I think I did pretty well under the circumstances. It is a bit strange to go forward 30 years. Then we get Thompson back in the present now, exiting the library. That's the Thatcher Library. Then we're in the present again. Keep up, everybody. Bernstein, now again a very old man, is questioned about Rosebud. So he's now talking to Thompson in the present. Bernstein recalls that Kane hired the best journalists available to build the Inquirer's circulation. Kane rose to power by successfully manipulating public opinion regarding the Spanish-American War, as we talked about before, and marrying Emily Norton. We'll get on to her in a sec. While Bernstein is talking, there's a large framed portrait of Kane on the wall above a large roaring fire. Not the last large roaring fire as well. Okay, now this is why it's a bit strange, because we flash back again to the time we were at just before we flash forward 30 years. In other words, Kane and Leland are now arriving at the Inquirer. They're both in hats, they're both looking happy and quite dashing. Didn't realise that Joseph Cotton was actually 10 years older than Orson Welles. They look roughly the same age. He looks a bit older, but wouldn't have thought it was 10 years. As characters, they're on something of an equal footing at this point. So Kane argues with the much older editor, Carter, about the content of the paper, and Carter this is really a repetition of the Kane and Thatcher relationship, to be honest. And Kane is really commanding the action as Orson Welles is commanding the screen, basically. Now, there's an interesting bit here. We learn from Carter, this older editor, that the paper has been opening 12 hours a day. So obviously it's been closed for 12 hours a day, but Kane intends to live permanently in Carter's office and have the paper open 24 hours a day. And the quote is, "The news goes on 24 hours a day," which is, of course, the way that people look at news now. It's not even on the hour, it's by the minute, by the second even. Kane draws up the famous Declaration of Principles to be printed in the newspaper. This document is clearly inspired by the Declaration of Independence. There's even some similar language in it, and there's a promise of no special interests. When I was watching this, I was thinking, when he's saying no special interests, he's almost bringing up the subject of special interests, meaning that the special interest that you might be expecting won't be there. You know what I mean? It's a bit like that. There's some ominous foreshadowing here. Bernstein says to Kane,
"You don't want to make any promises, Mr. Kane, you don't want to keep. These will be kept."
That will be a bit of a theme as well, to do with promises. Leland notes the use of I when Kane is dictating the declaration. He keeps saying, "Oh, why do you keep saying I?" rather than we. And Leland takes the original, saying, quote, "I have a hunch it might turn out to be very important." Bit of foreshadowing there. Right, just a couple more scenes in part 3 here. Kane, Leland and Bernstein discuss the success of the Chronicle, which is the rival newspaper. They look out the window and we see that circulation of the Inquirer, their paper, is 26,000. He brings them to the Chronicle, whose circulation is 495,000. Now, there's a nice trick where a photo of their staff, which we hear took 20 years to build up with the Chronicle, becomes a live shot of them now as Inquirer staff. 6 years later, Kane's basically stolen them from the Chronicle, and he talks about being like a kid in a candy store, and he's got his candy. And the circulation of the Inquirer is now 684,000. So it was 26,000 before they got these hotshot reporters to work for their paper. And then quite a famous scene, Kane holds a party to celebrate, and we got the dancing girls, and we got this famous Kane song. Kane dances with the girls, and Leland and Bernstein sing along. Now, if you notice here, you've got low ceilings, and the reason is that, something I mentioned when I was talking about the making of the film, the mics were planted in them, and so that they weren't too far up, they had these low ceilings. Now, the Mr. Kane song was a Mexican melody, I believe, with lyrics added to it. I don't think Bernard Herrmann did the lyrics. I don't think he was a lyric writer. And Leland and Bernstein talk, and again, we've got some interesting framing. You've got Kane and the dancing girls framed between Leland and Bernstein. So again, Kane is in the middle, just as he was when he was a kid, playing on his sled. Leland starts to question Kane's ideas, and he brings up a good point. So you've got these reporters from the Chronicle. Now, imagine if the Chronicle was more of a left-leaning paper and the Inquirer was more right-leaning, or vice versa. Would the reporters then just modify their political views just to fit the paper?
That's your part. What's the matter?
Who says a miss was made to kill? And when he leads one always tries to do exactly this. Who buys the food? Who buys the drinks? Who thinks the dough was made to spend and acts the way he thinks? Now is it Joe?
Bernstein, these men who were with the Chronicle, weren't they just as devoted to the Chronicle policies as they are now to our policies?
Sure, they're just like anybody else. They got work to do, they do it. Only they happen to be the best men in the business.
We stand for the same things the Chronicle stands for, Bernstein?
Certainly not. Listen, Mr. Kane, he'll have them changed to his kind of newspaper men in a week.
There's always a chance, of course, that they'll change Mr. Kane without his knowing it.
What if the opposite happens and the new reporters change Kane without him realising it? So this seed is being planted that, number one, Leland is going to challenge Kane and has his doubts about Kane, and number two, that Kane is going to change. But Leland is still on board for now. Something I did talk about in one of the earlier parts, did Kane's later life influence Wells as he got older? I don't really have an answer for that. It's just something to ponder. I suppose anyone who becomes powerful and wealthy and famous, as Kane and Wells did, there's going to be certain blind spots you get because you just don't have a normal life. You've got people fawning over you all the time. With this Kane song, if you remember a little bit earlier, I mentioned the Union Forever. So White Stripes fans, on the album White Blood Cells, there's a song called The Union Forever, and it is basically the Charlie Kane song. So here's a live clip of the White Stripes performing this song.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in gold mines, oil wells, shipping, or real estate. What would I like to have been? Everything you hate. 'Cause I can't be love for that breath, no true love. You can't be love for that breath, no true love. There is a man, a certain man, and for the poor you may be sure that he'll do all he can. Who is this one? Whose favorite son, just by his action, has the traction magnets on the run? Who likes to smoke, enjoys a joke, and wouldn't get a bit upset if he were really broke? With wealth and fame, it's still the same. I bet you 5 you're not alive if you don't know his name.
Jack White co-owned a record label. I don't know if he still does, but he started a record label, and it was called Third Man Records, which is obviously a nod to another Orson Welles film. Now, I mentioned about these ceilings. They were covered with muslin cloth to hide these mics, and they were placed at various spots in this scene, so all the sound, the foreground, background, left and right, could be recorded live. One of the things that Citizen Kane is most famous for is this idea of the foreground and the background both being in sharp focus. And I suppose it's a similar thing with the music. If music is playing slightly further back in a room, it's not going to be that much quieter. So why should it not be heard quite clearly by the viewer? Okay, one more scene in this part. So cable is received from Kane, who arrives back, and then he leaves with Emily Morton, who I mentioned earlier, and she is the niece of the current president of the USA in the story. Kane gets engaged to her, and a political career beckons, as it did actually for Orson Welles, because he did some political campaigning in the early 40s. Bernstein predicts Kane may become president. Kane is in a white suit here. He's got a moustache and a pipe, which will be pretty much ever present from now on as he gets older. He looks older, and he's certainly a few pounds heavier. I don't know if that was his weight. I mean, there's probably a manipulation going on there. As we are in the story, things are still going well for Kane. Leland and Bernstein are on board. He's just got married. Now, in terms of that marriage, those of you who know the film, you'll know what's coming in the next part. one of the scenes coming up fairly soon in the story. Did he marry her because she was the niece of the president? I mean, they seem kind of like two quite attractive people, successful people. So it seems like a match made in heaven, really. You probably know how that goes, but we'll get to that in the next part. So thank you for listening to part 3. If you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can make a one-off donation for really my 3 podcasts, Glass Onion on John Lennon, Life and Life Only, and this one, Film Gold. And I'll see you soon for part 4. For now, all the best and goodbye.
So high, people passing by don't even stop to look no more. But people do believe in you, so tell us all what we should do, building up them walls of sanity. Charlie Kane, Mr. Charlie Kane.